Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. Pakistan will today make a significant gesture for peace by handing back Indian Wing Commander Abhinandan. Pakistani officials' consistent stance has been to remind the world and India that for peace to prevail, the long-standing issue of Kashmir must be resolved. However, in an era of anti-Pakistan hysteria because of upcoming Indian elections, peaceful overtures and pleas for dialogue are falling on deaf ears. To discuss all of that a bit further, we're joined now by Mr. Khurshid M, Kasuri, who is the former Foreign Minister of Pakistan. He's joining us on the line from right here in Lahore. Minister Kasuri, thanks for joining us here in the Scope. What do you make of today's handover?
That if you compare Indian attitude, including that of the media, the government and the military, Pakistani response, both of all the speeches by the Prime Minister and also by the military spokesman Asif Ghafoor, they've been, measured. They've spoken more of peace, but they've been very firm that if Pakistan's sovereignty were violated, Pakistan would respond, and they have done it. And on every occasion, Pakistan had looked more mature. And that is a sign of strength. When you start shrieking and shouting and posturing, as is being done in India, it's largely because of the coming elections. It's very unfortunate that the regional security is being sacrificed at the altar of Indian elections and the desire of various political parties at point scoring. So I think basically Pakistan cannot be faulted if India, as you say, significant sections in Indian media. But if you look at serious sections in Indian media, I've been following that, including their analysts. They feel that Prime Minister Imran Khan his speech, his decision has been very well received on the Indian side also. There's no poll which can be conducted. If you look at the screaming going on in some studios, not all, in some studios in Indian TV stations, yes, you get that impression. But I don't think, if you look at which I do follow, and I'm sure you do as well, that is not the view of serious-minded Indians. In fact, some of them are alarmed, including their strategic thinkers, because they themselves have said that Prime Minister Modi is, using this for political purposes. And let me also add that the Indian opposition, which has yesterday or day before for the first time broken silence, because very difficult for politicians, particularly whether it's in India or Pakistan, when it's an issue of national security, everybody tends to speak with the same voice, as happened in Pakistani parliament in the joint session.
Yes.
But in India, the 21 parties met, opposition parties, met collectively, was using this for political purposes, and they of course referred to the brave or courageous actions of their armed forces, quote unquote. But they said that it's quite clear. So you really can't fault Prime Minister Imran Khan for any of this thing that's going on in India.
Mr. Kasuri, one of the things that keeps coming up, obviously, when it comes to such incidents is, if we look at the timeline, obviously, over the years, there has always been escalation of some sort or another, by India, especially when it comes close to elections. And one of the things that Pakistani officials have brought up is that, listen, we really need to resolve this long-standing issue of Kashmir for long-term peace in this region. How important a stance is that, and what do you make of that?
Kashmir is concerned, for all practical purposes, India has lost Kashmiris. In fact, as Mehbooba Mufti, the former Chief Minister of Jammu and Kashmir, Indian-occupied Jammu and Kashmir, she said that it seems that India wants Kashmir without the Kashmiris. Now, I could not improve on that statement. And the way that the youth in Kashmir have decided to confront the Indian armed forces because it seems, have had enough, and their lives have been made a misery. The honor of their women has been violated. And I'm not saying that. The Human Rights Report, as for the United Nations Human Rights Commissioner's report on human rights, bears ample testimony to the grave violation of human rights in Jammu and Kashmir. And so that's one aspect. Number two, the previous governments, including those of the BJP, realized that this was not possible permanently to keep a people in bondage, and that is why under Mr. Vajpayee, who also belonged to the BJP, the situation adopted was different. They appointed the Indian interlocutors to talk to various Kashmiri groups, and now also, in fact, what Prime Minister Modi is doing is not being supported by all Indians. For example, Mr. Dulat, the former head of RAW, has even today disagreed with Prime Minister Modi's actions. And Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, I was reading a statement by him, it's also much more positive, and it talks of peace and the need for de-escalation. So yes, as far as Kashmir is concerned, since I dealt with Congress government, and also with the BJP government led by Prime Minister Vajpayee, I know that they both realize that there is no option but to talk to the Kashmiris and to Pakistan. As far as the current government is concerned, I can only hope and pray that after the Indian elections are over, and I say after the Indian elections are over because during the campaign, unfortunately, polarization, that is hatred between Hindus and Muslims, hatred between India and Pakistan, is being used to the hilt by the ruling party to advance its chances in the forthcoming elections. So, of course, they will do what suits them electorally. But whether that will bear fruit, only time will tell. I have a feeling that in the past, when, for example, on the occasion of the Mumbai attacks, which were very tragic indeed, at that time, the BJP or some other RSS elements particularly were advising Prime Minister Manmohan Singh to go ballistic. Well, he behaved more responsibly, and do you know what the electorate did? Electorate gave him a vote of confidence, he won the election again. So it's no guarantee that just because you go ballistic and towards Pakistan, you will have electoral success. Yes, Prime Minister Narendra Modi has lost 5 states, 3 major states and 2 relatively smaller ones, and he's even lost in UP. On seats vacated by the Prime Minister, Chief Minister and the Deputy Chief Minister.
Okay, Mr.
So
Kasuri,
we can anticipate that they will try and keep the pot boiling. But I think there are other actors at play, and the opposition will also understand that Prime Minister has really tried to use this to advance his electoral purposes. Pakistan can do no further except to behave responsibly, which we have behaved.
Okay, Mr. Kasuri, we'll leave that as our final word. I know you have a busy schedule ahead. We, of course, appreciate your time, sir. That was Khurshid M. Kasuri, former foreign minister, speaking to us right here from on the line in Lahore. Let me now introduce our next guest. We're joined now by Mr. Masood Khan, who is president of Azad Jammu and Kashmir, and he's joining us from Islamabad. Mr. Khan, as always, we appreciate your time and for taking your time out to speak to us here in the scope. Mr. Khan, what do you make of Pakistan's peaceful gesture that will occur today about the handover, or the handback, I should say, of this Indian pilot?
This gesture should lead to de-escalation, and it should stem further deterioration of the situation if good sense and sanity prevails on the Indian side, because they started this round of escalation and tension by crossing the LOC and flying their aircraft across the LOC and into the Pakistan airspace. So I think that this should spiral down. This kind of tension should spiral down. And in that sense, this is a huge confidence-building measure. And we'll see how much sagacity and magnanimity is shown by India.
Exactly. And on that last point that you made, I wanted to in fact ask, and I know of course this will be speculation, but what do you think that the Indian side will do? Because obviously, as we know, the context of what has occurred recently is the Indian elections. A lot of pressure, I imagine, right now on Prime Minister Modi and the BJP. What do you make of that?
That pressure has subsided because, I mean, there are some other dissenting voices, including in the political circles. There was a meeting of the political parties, Congress and other regional and national parties, and they have criticized Mr. Narendra Modi for politicizing a national security issue, what they call the national security issue. So I think that good sense should prevail. The Indian civil society and Indian citizens are waking up to the kind of catastrophe which Indian extremist agenda was whipping up. So I think that they should roll back their aggression, they should roll back their rhetoric, and I hope that sanity would prevail in India in taking decisions.
And, you know, Mr. Khan, it's interesting. I was looking at the timeline of the past, and whenever Indian escalations have occurred of this sort of magnitude, it's always been close to some form of an election or not in India. What do you make of that? Why is there, do you think, this need on the Indian side of having such an escalation close to elections? How does that help them politically?
That's very regrettable. I mean, in Indian elections, Pakistan is put on their electoral platforms of the political parties, and usually when they include Pakistan or Kashmir in their political manifestos, they spew hatred against Pakistan, against Kashmiris, against Kashmiri Muslims and Muslims within India, who are their own citizens. So this is regrettable. I would call that this is fascism to start with, and therefore this is not acceptable today in any civilized part of the world. They whip up this Hindu extremism, violent Hindu extremism, and direct it against Pakistan. All the matters related to Pakistan or Kashmir are negative. This is their negative agenda. And they present Pakistan and Kashmiris as demons, which is not true, because in fact, it is the Indians, the Indian government or Indian establishment, which is terrorizing, brutalizing the people of Jammu and Kashmir and crushing their right to self-determination. They are treating the Kashmir territory, the disputed territory of Jammu and Kashmir, as a colony. And all the steps that they are taking there violate international law, international human rights law, and international humanitarian law. So the tragedy is that the oppressor tries to project itself as the victim, and they try to change the subject. I mean, the international community was in the process of holding India accountable in different forums, in the Human Rights Council or in the British Parliament or the European Parliament, and now they are presenting this issue as a national security issue between India and Pakistan, and they want to divert attention from the atrocities that Indian forces, Indian occupation forces have been committing in the occupied territory with impunity. I think that this kind of acquiescence in India's crimes against humanity must be stopped by the international community. One thing that I want to add is that one big advantage coming out of this very tragic exchange that has taken place between the two countries is that Kashmir has been internationalized. In Brussels, in London, in Washington, on that
point,
everybody have recognized that this is an international issue.
Indeed, Mr. Khan. And on that point of which you made there, do you think that this then brings more impetus to the need then to resolve this issue for long-term peace to prevail in this region?
Absolutely. I mean, I have said that the attention that has built up in the recent past in regard to the Jammu and Kashmir dispute and India-Pakistan nuclear rivalry and so on, this should not be transient because, the international community has a very short attention span. And I fear that after this crisis has been resolved, the international community may become inattentive to the Kashmir dispute once again. So I think the one lesson that the international community has learned through the recent crisis is that the United Nations Security Council, the Secretary General of the United Nations, and other international forums must get involved for the resolution of the Jammu and Kashmir dispute.
One final point before I let you go, Mr. Khan, is that of the OIC. And you know well that Foreign Minister Qureshi today announced that Pakistan would not be attending, of course, the OIC summit. What do you make of why India was even given this invitation. There's talk, of course, of observer status, but that, according to OIC's own rules, would probably not occur in such a situation at the very least. What do you make of that entire situation and how international bodies have reacted?
The decision was taken by the host, Abu Dhabi, and this has been done without consultation with other OIC members, because this issue was not discussed in any plenary meeting or any of the previous ministerial conferences. So the UAE has used its prerogative as a host. But let me tell you that the people of Jammu and Kashmir are deeply disappointed by this invitation, and we find it galling that the Indian foreign minister is speaking at the forum of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, which has been year after year condemning India's atrocities and repression in the occupied territory, and has been passing resolutions demanding realization of the right to self-determination of the people of Jammu and Kashmir.
Yes.
And I think that if there is any chatter or talk about giving observer status to India and making this guest of honor thing a permanent feature, this kind of diplomatic movement must be stopped. And in this regard, I think Pakistan's diplomat and Pakistan's foreign ministry can and should play a decisive role.
All right, Mr. Khan, we'll leave it there at that. Of course, we appreciate your time and insight and analysis. Always, that was Mr. Masood Khan, President of Azad Jammu and Kashmir, speaking there from Islamabad. Viewers, we're going to go into a very short break. We're going to keep a very close eye, though, on this situation. Stay with us. We'll be right back with more on this. Viewers, we're still here in the scope, and we're continuing to discuss, of course, ongoing, or now dying down, I should say, India-Pakistan tensions, and of course the handover of that Indian pilot, as well as, of course, the entire issue of Kashmir. To discuss all of that a bit further, we're now joined by former Ambassador Zamir Akram, who is joining us on the line now from the Pakistani capital, Islamabad. Ambassador, thanks for your time and for taking your time out to speak to us here in the scope. Ambassador Akram, what do you make of this peaceful gesture that Pakistan is making today in the handover, or the handback, I should say, of this Indian pilot?
Well, I know that there is controversy on this. Some people are not in favor of it, but personally I think that it's a good gesture, not because it's going to make much difference with the Indians, but internationally I think it will be seen in a positive light. So from that perspective, it's the right thing to do.
And, you know, Ambassador, Foreign Minister Qureshi was speaking at the joint session of Parliament today, and he said that there have been offers of mediation from the United Nations, even from Russia and others. And obviously, Pakistan, according to him, is ready to sit down across the table with India at either of these venues or others. What do you make of that? Pakistan's stance has been consistent in that regard, hasn't it?
Yes, I mean, right from the beginning, ever since this incident in Pulwama took place, the Prime Minister and the government broadly has offered a dialogue to the Indians to address this issue and to ensure that there is no breakdown of the peace between the two countries. Unfortunately, the Indians did not accept these offers, and now we have international players offering to mediate or to help de-escalate, and we are in favor of that. So it's a welcome step. The question is whether the Indians are ready for it at this stage or not. But we have done the right thing, and we have conveyed that we will be willing to cooperate in this matter.
And so then, diplomatically, then what do you think, Ambassador Akram, may happen next on the part of India as vis-a-vis a reaction to all of this? I imagine Prime Minister Modi may find that he's put himself into a corner. Would that be a correct assessment?
Well, in reality, he is in a difficult situation because he faces this international pressure to end the escalation or end the confrontation with Pakistan. On the other hand, he needs to show, he needs to have a face-saving way out of this, because for him, it's important from their election point of view. So he is in a difficult situation, but I think at the end of the day, with the international pressure building up and also because I think the Prime Minister has made it very clear that if the Indians launch any other attack on Pakistan, we will respond. So that's his choice then whether he wants to continue with this confrontation and face a Pakistani response yet again, which we have shown that we can do. So it's a tough call for him, but I think at the end of the day, he would accept some form of de-escalation. Now, what he can ask for as a face saving is some kind of delivery on the so-called terrorist group, or what they allege are Jaish-e-Mohammed terrorists. So what he will be looking for some kind of action by Pakistan on that score.
Now, looking at the timeline, Ambassador Akram, and you probably know this much better than I do, of course, but looking at the timeline of Indian escalation over these years, whenever escalation has occurred, it's been seemingly at times close to Indian elections. Why do you think it is that politics in India revolves so much around anti-Pakistan hysteria at times?
Well, that's true. It's true. It's unfortunate, but it's true. By comparison, the politics in Pakistan, India hardly figures as an issue. But in India, unfortunately, these different political parties, particularly the BJP under Mr. Modi, have made it into an election campaign to criticize Pakistan, to use Pakistan as a bogeyman for their own objectives. They try and push themselves as being more muscular, more tough with Pakistan in order to get people to vote for them. I don't think that really works because the people in India really are concerned with their day-to-day issues. It's about poverty, it's about employment, it's about making ends meet. And right now, even now, the big issue in India is, for instance, the lack of employment, the suicide by hundreds of farmers. So these are all issues which will actually will be the real issues in the elections. And that's also partly why they want to divert attention from these real issues to, using Pakistan as a bogeyman.
And Ambassador Akram, Prime Minister Khan, when he was speaking to the joint sessions of Parliament, had said that, listen, Pakistan wants peace and stability for its own people's sake as well, for progress in this country, for economic progress and otherwise, of course. And he said that obviously that cannot occur in a state where the country is in a state of heightened alert or war or escalation, etc. Do you think that then when we talk about the issue of Kashmir, the long-standing issue of Kashmir, for peace to then prevail in this region, that issue needs to be resolved, doesn't it, as the Prime Minister has said?
I mean, that's for sure, because as the Prime Minister said, and as we know in Pakistan for a long time, this problem between India and Pakistan, these tensions between India and Pakistan are because of the continuing Kashmir dispute and even worse, the continuing Indian repression of the people of occupied Kashmir. So as long as that continues, these kind of actions that we saw in Pulwama can recur. And this will recur because the Indians have unleashed this reign of terror on the people of Kashmir. And I think particularly the younger generation of Kashmir is simply not prepared to take it anymore. And they're willing to sacrifice their lives in response, to take revenge as this person did, because he had a history of being tortured by the Indian security forces. And so he took this action, sacrificed his life. And there are, I'm sure, others who would be willing to do the same thing.
All right, we're going to say thank you to Ambassador Zamir Akram, former ambassador who was speaking to us from the Pakistani capital, Islamabad. Ambassador Akram, we sincerely appreciate you taking your time out of your busy schedule to speak to us here in the scope. Viewers, we're going to conclude just this segment for now. Of course, a lot still happening, fluid developments still in the works. But as we know, Pakistan has made this peaceful gesture now to hand over this Indian pilot back to India. And of course, there have been offers of mediation put on the table by the UN and Russia, as I said, to one of our guests there. We also know, as the Prime Minister Khan has said, that the long-standing issue of Kashmir must be resolved for there to be long-term peace prevailing in this region for the sake of Pakistanis as well as Indians, of course. As our guest said earlier, everybody wants peace, and for progress to occur for the peoples, there must be peace in this region. We'll keep a very close eye on that. Don't go anywhere, though. I'll be back after this short break with our next segment. Thank you for staying with Scope, viewers. Now, the second summit between the North Korean and American leaders has been a failure. The Hanoi meeting, according to Trump, fell apart because Kim demanded a full lifting of sanctions. The North Koreans dispute this, saying they asked for partial relief. With growing domestic pressure, how can Trump move forward on this issue? To discuss that a bit further, we're joined now by Mr. Michael Lane, who is the president of the American Institute for Foreign Policy. He's joining us now from Washington, D.C. We're also joined by former Ambassador Najamuddin Sheikh, who is joining us on the line from Karachi. Thank you both for joining us and for taking your time out to speak to us here in the scope about this issue. Michael, I wanted to start with you, if I may. What do you make of how this summit worked out? Trump obviously tweeting and discussing about how the North Koreans, in his point of view, wanted complete relief on sanctions. The North Koreans responding, no, we wanted partial relief. Why that confusion, do you think?
Well, I think it's typical diplomatic posturing as to who was responsible for the fact that an agreement was not reached. But here's the key. The conventional wisdom domestically in the United States going into that summit was that Donald Trump was weakened at home, that the investigations were starting to take a toll on his presidency, and he needed to come home with a winning deal from the Korean summit. Donald Trump apparently looked at it a different way. He looked at it where he needed to advance the United States and the world's interests on the world stage. He needed to get Kim to agree to denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. And when that didn't happen, even if there is a dispute as to exactly how many of the sanctions against Korea were asked for to be lifted, Donald Trump walked away because a number of reasons. The first is the Kim family has made a lifetime of playing the United States and United States presidents for a fool. Kim the Elder made Bill Clinton look like a complete fool. He made George Bush II look like a complete fool. President Obama, not wanting to be made a fool of by North Korea, decided to make a fool of himself by pursuing a policy of strategic patience, which merely allowed Korea to refine and develop nuclear weapons and at the same time refine and develop their rocketry abilities to deliver those weapons. Donald Trump is taking a different attitude. Donald Trump is taking a different approach. We'll see if walking away from this summit does things internally in Korea and makes them a little bit more receptive to going along with a new playbook rather than their old successful playbook.
Ambassador Sheikh, do you agree? Do you think it is that U.S. domestic pressure should have really forced Donald Trump to come up with some sort of an agreement during the summit? And considering the failure of that, what do you think that will then mean for Donald Trump coming back home empty-handed?
On the contrary, I think domestic public opinion in the United States would have been very unhappy with an agreement which called for denuclearization with no commitment for denuclearization and concessions being made. I think Trump would have liked an agreement for his own political reasons, but not because of domestic public opinion. The domestic public opinion was much more in line with John Bolton and Mike Pompeo, that if you're going to do this, you're going to do this to have the results that you talked about, that you want complete denuclearization as the step that is to be taken before any concessions are made. I think they would have gone along with the fact that there was some progress, some significant progress, dismantling of a site, clear evidence that the CIA could check, that the NSA could check before to show that substantive advance was being made towards denuclearization. So I think Trump has played his cards well in terms of saying that I am maintaining my relationship with our North Korean leader, but I'm not. I'm just going to walk away because it's better not to have a deal than to have a bad one. Now, what this means for the future, I think for the first time you saw North Korean leader talk to a foreign correspondent and try and answer a question directly. Also, you heard him talk about the fact that he has pressures at home. Now, the pressures at home obviously will relate to the fact that there should be some advancement towards the economic betterment of the country that he has spoken of and that he claims is his ambition. He's sitting in Vietnam, and Vietnam is an example of what can happen when you give priority to your economic development rather than your development in terms of defense or etc.
Ambassador Sheikh, if I may, I wanted to pick up on that point that you just made there because I think it's a very pertinent one. Michael, I wanted to put that to you because for this summit, in fact, North Korea had said that it would face a food shortfall of around 1.4 million tons this year, and that is obviously not a small number. So for North Korea, there's a lot on the stake, a lot at stake here, isn't it? And I wonder what you make of that point of view then. For the North Korean leader to come back empty-handed is also significant, isn't it?
It is, and I think it actually bodes well for a future deal. Look, President Trump's main thrust, he had a number of different arguments he was making with Chairman Kim, but his main thrust was that North Korea could become an economic jewel of the Far East. And he would use certain examples. I don't think, as the ambassador mentioned, I don't think it was an accident that this summit took place in Vietnam. It gave Kim the chance to look around and see what a country that was very much like his just a couple decades ago and the dramatic economic progress that they have made for their people over that time. So the disappointment of both heads of state going home without a deal. This is not the end of the discussion. I'm sure that Secretary Pompeo is on the phone as we speak with his counterpart, telling and expressing to North Korea that the deal is still on the table, that if they want to have, small discussions over small refinements and things like that, it's perfectly okay. But the deal to make the future North Korea an economic powerhouse similar to other jewels in Asia is still on the table, and that ultimately has to have some influence with Chairman Kim.
How do you feel about that issue, about North Korean concern for national security, for their own sovereignty? They fear that the U.S. would attack them if they gave up their deterrence.
Yes, I don't think that's a well-placed fear. The United States really doesn't have any interest in attacking and occupying or anything North Korea. So I think that's a misplaced fear. There is a lesser fear, however, that I think probably is legitimate, and that is that if this is not done simultaneously, if they do it President Trump's way, which is North Korea denuclearizes and then United States assistance and aid comes in, after denuclearization, will the United States stand up to its promise at that time? I think that is a more realistic concern on behalf of the North Koreans. Okay. I can only say that there's a track record. It's in the United States' interest for North Korea to join the world family of nations. I don't know what the guarantees are. I don't know what the final deal looks like. But ultimately, this is in both countries' interest to strike a deal North Korea's people will be so much better off if they become an economic powerhouse.
The Iran nuclear deal, Michael, is something that the North Koreans, and I know we've spoken about this in previous shows as well, Michael, I imagine the North Koreans would look at that and say, can the U.S. be trusted? How do you feel about that?
They will. And I think it's a reasonable question, and I think it's a reasonable concern on the part of the North Koreans. But you have to look at how the deal was put together. As we've discussed before, the Iran nuclear deal was only a personal agreement between President Obama and the other parties present at the talks in the nuclear Iran deal. It was easily taken away by President Trump with just the signing of a pen. Anything that the United States strikes with North Korea, I would expect that Chairman Kim would insist that it be legislated and approved by the United States Congress, so that any president coming in afterwards would not be able to just sign it away with one stroke of a pen. There are ways of making the United States much more legally committed to these deals than President Obama did with the Iran nuclear deal. And Kim would be well within his rights and certainly understandable to insist that those factors be taken into account.
Ambassador Sheikh, the factor of the Iran nuclear deal, as I put to Michael, the North Koreans, I imagine, look at that and take lesson when it comes to trusting the United States, wouldn't they?
Of course they would. There are lots of examples which the North Koreans would have in mind, even the relationship with the European Union and things that are happening in that direction with President Trump. So they would want congressional ratification, if you will. It's not going to have the shape of a treaty, but it's certainly going to have something that must have a legal impact in terms of future administrations. But the point is that that's a long way off. The first things that need to happen or can happen is partial dismantlement of the sites that exist. And at the moment, I think what I saw from President Kim's approach seemed to suggest that that may well be something that he would be prepared for. When he says that he wants partial lifting of sanctions, he is really suggesting that there will be steps I will take which will make it possible for you to give me that partial lifting of sanctions. So we have to see. I think President Trump, one feels sad saying this, but he's played his cards well in terms of saying that the personal relationship exists, the personal relationship will continue, and we've shown President Kim exactly what could happen if he chose to make it, as Michael put it, the jewel of Southeast Asia. These are things that will matter to him, and as you pointed out, they need 1.4 million tons of food. It's going to be that much more of a pressure on him. Indeed. I think he is trying to now acquire a more cosmopolitan picture, paint a more cosmopolitan picture of himself, addressing a Western correspondent, addressing questions that are put to him in that particular context.
Indeed.
So I think he has the inclination. And perhaps this process is going to take years. It's not going to happen overnight. But he may well take the first steps while President Trump is still in office.
All right, Ambassador Sheikh, I know that you have to go because you have a busy schedule. I'm going to thank you, of course, for your time and, of course, for your insight and analysis. I'm going to continue the conversation, though. We're still, of course, sticking with Mr. Michael Lane, who is joining us from Washington, D.C. I'm going to add another voice to this conversation. We're now joined as well by Mr. Majid Mahmood, who is a researcher at the Islamabad Institute for Strategic Studies, the ISSI, and he's joining us from the Pakistani capital on the line. Majid, as always, thanks for joining us here in The Scope. Majid, what do you make of the collapse of these talks as they happened in Hanoi in Vietnam? I imagine this is not just a big blow to the United States specifically, but also to its own ally, South Korea, and its President Moon Jae-in.
Yes, the summit ended without any agreement. As we all know, and you have been discussing that in your program. But the overall, my sense is that these talks will resume in a later date, because Trump has this history of abruptly leaving meetings and other important discussions when he feels that there is no need for a deal. But beyond the scope, I would like you to take a bigger picture of the situation. Okay. Chinese North Korean policy is subject to its larger East Asia policy, which is centering around China. So it appears that from the last 1.5 years, especially since the Singapore summit, that America is trying to cool down the North Korean front, so that it can focus on the Chinese threat and the trade war that is going on. And we have this March 1 deadline, which is passed, extending the deadlines for tariffs. So this is in the big picture. North Korea, America would like to cool down, and it is not in a hurry. If you see Trump's statements, Mike Pompeo's statement, they are not in a hurry to reach a deal. And if you see the outcome of the joint statement in the Singapore summit, they talked about improving first about the U.S.-North Korea relationship, and then the establishment of a peace regime in North Korea, and then denuclearization talks. Traditionally, denuclearization talks have been at the top of the agenda of the summit. Okay. So my sense is that America is not eager to have a deal unless its larger Chinese problem, its direction.
That's an interesting point you made there, Majid. I want to put that to Michael. Michael, do you also view it in that this is something to do with the larger, really, rivalry between China and the United States in that region? And I wanted to throw the South Korea factor into all of this. I imagine time is not on the side of Moon Jae-in, who came into office wanting peace with North Korea.
Well, let me take the second piece first. President Moon, of course, has really staked most of his presidency on improving relations with North Korea. It's the single issue for which he makes worldwide headlines on a regular basis. It was announced yesterday, and it's not a surprise, obviously, that President Trump has talked with President Moon, and that he will take the lead in continuing the liaison and continuing the discussions with Chairman Kim to see where they can come closer to an agreement. So at some point, an agreement can finally be reached. So I think President Moon has not only his work cut out for him, but he has his agenda for the next however long it's going to take. As far as the China picture and the whole thing, you cannot minimize China at all in this whole thing. North Korea is pretty much 90% dependent on China for their existence. They do 90% of their trade with China. They get food from China. They get all of their energy from China. I mean, it's just it's one of those things where you just can't minimize the importance of China in the relationship. So yes, the United States is always keeping that into account. But there's one other thing that we haven't discussed yet, not just China's relative position on the world stage, but the United States is actually in the final throes of very, very delicate and very, very complex trade talks with China at this time. And I don't think that it was unnoticed by President Xi. And certainly it was a side benefit to the United States for President Trump to leave the Vietnam summit. President Xi now knows that Donald Trump is the kind of guy who will walk away if he doesn't have an acceptable deal. This has to have a positive impact, I think, on the trade talks between the U.S. and China.
That's very interesting. Majid, do you agree with that? Do you think this is all, again, Trump's walking away, this is all very dramatic, but do you think this then has that positive effect on the U.S.'s part, at least, in trade talks even with China?
Yes, it is linked. I agree with this, that the Hanoi summit was linked also with the trade talks that are going on between U.S. and China. Of course, it has its own independent agency, the North Korean issue, but the China factor is also there. And since now that, as if you see the reporting from the United States, the talks have been entered in a crucial stage, the U.S.-China trade talks. So there is Trump is also signaling to the Chinese, that look, if I'm not getting a deal, then I will get out of the meeting and I will slap more tariffs on the Chinese goods. So this is one of the signals that Xi Jinping may have read from this Hanoi talks.
Okay. Very well. We'll leave there as our final word, but we appreciate all of our guests and their time. Let me thank them. We were joined there at the end by Majid Mahmood, researcher at ISSI, who was speaking to us from Islamabad. We were also joined by Mr. Michael Lane, who is joining us from early morning there in Washington, D.C. He's the president of the American Institute for Foreign Policy. And earlier we were joined by former Ambassador Najamuddin Sheikh, who was speaking to us from Karachi. Now, viewers, as all of our guests spoke about, there's a lot of a broader picture here, macro issues such as China-U.S. rivalry, such as the trade talks, and even for North Korea, there's a lot of at stake really here. At 1.4 million tons of food shortfall just this year for the country, and on the other side we have Donald Trump, who came back empty-handed at a time of domestic pressure with the Russia collusion investigation heating up, etc. So we'll keep a very close eye on these developments, because it's certainly not the last of the North Korea/United States meetings and issue and negotiations. But that's all for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi, and this has been Scope.